helpers or volunteers to do language interpretation and translation for you, making sure that they have the basic skills and knowledge of the ethics and best practices of language interpreters is really important. And we talked last week a lot about sort of some of the best practices, like why body positioning matters and why eye contact matters and where you sit and speaking in the first person, managing the session, et cetera, et cetera. And this week, we're going to talk about the interpreter code of ethics, right? And ethical behavior for anyone who's in the position of acting as an interpreter. So really, we're just going to talk about just a very brief review of what we did last week, because I'm going to really make an effort to keep this to 1 hour today so that people who can't stay late are still able to do Q&A. And then we're just going to jump into talking about what it means to when we say interpreter code of ethics. Just very basically from last week, we talked about the differences between interpretation and translation and how being bilingual doesn't mean that you're a good interpreter or a good translator. Being a good translator doesn't necessarily mean you're a great interpreter, and vice versa. And then, if you are acting as an interpreter, body positioning is so important. Speaking in the first person is so important. And it's just so important for volunteer interpreters to know that they need to step out of the way and do everything they can to increase the engagement between the speaker and the subject and not themselves be the center of attention, right? It's absolutely crucial, because otherwise there's kind of like a comedy of errors or a feedback loop or a domino effect that can happen where, people don't know, who's in charge. People don't know if the interpreter is really conveying everything that's being said. The subject might feel alienated or isolated from their own participation if the interpreter is the center of attention, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the best practices of the interpretation profession take years to master. So I don't expect that any volunteers are going to instantly get it right, because like anything else, all of these skills take practice, but you got to start somewhere. And I'm a big believer in the quote, just start where you are, start doing, and people will learn, and you can be there to guide them and share this information with them. So with that being said, let's talk about interpreter ethics. And I want to start by asking you guys what you think the role of a language interpreter specifically should be, apart from, just conveying information, right? Just, interpreting. So just shout out anything that pops into your head. What do you think that interpreter's role should be? Do you think there are limitations? What do you think ethically, would play into the role of an interpreter? Just kind of anything you have, or anything you think might be the case.
A bridge or a conduit connecting people.
Connecting people, absolutely. Okay, what else?
Interpreting the culture.
The culture, okay, good. What else?
Information confidential.
Yeah, keeping information confidential is super important. What else do you think of when you think about the role of an interpreter or the ethics of an interpreter?
Ensuring the voice of the customer is being centered and not yours.
Yeah, that's a huge one. Yeah, so, before we jump into what the code of ethics is for an interpreter, I actually am currently reading a book, and I had no idea that it was going to talk about interpretation when I started it. And last night, I put this together because I was so excited that the book presents a perfect example of what's wrong with interpreters, doing things without adhering to the code of ethics. So it's straight out of this book that I've been reading about a mother of 9 children from a repressive religious sect who was asked to act as an interpreter at the clinic. And like the character had like this encyclopedic knowledge of, you know, giving birth and what it's like, but only an elementary school education and like super limited familiarity with even basic medical terminology or even the culture of medicine. And anyway, her character is pregnant and she's at the same clinic where she delivered all 9 of her babies, and the clinic serves a lot of women from her particular community. And so one day her midwife asks her to go into a room and interpret for a young girl. And so the first thing they did wrong is they sent her into the room, you know, before going in themselves, right? So they just sent this woman into a room to interpret, but the doctor wasn't there, the midwife wasn't there. And so what ended up happening is that the little girl, or the girl and the ad hoc interpreter started talking and getting to know each other, right? And that is like actually a really bad thing when you're interpreting. And in the midst of this conversation, the character like discovers that the child had been abused and she was pregnant by her abuser. And, you know, she's able to get the child to open up to her, and she's the only one who knows about the abuse. And so she tells the midwife, and the midwife basically says, I need to alert the authorities. I'm a mandated reporter. But the main character says, you know, don't do it yet. Please let me go to my community elders, you know, to give them time to respond to it before you go to the authorities. And it just turns into a total mess for, I'm sure, reasons that you guys can all understand. And later in the book, the clinic offers her a job as an interpreter, but they don't provide her with any training. And I mean, I'm assuming this, it's a novel, right? So who knows? But you know, there's a doctor there who's really mean, and she tells a lot of the patients not to bother listening to him. She doesn't know a lot of the medical terminology, so she just like explains what she does understand as opposed to interpreting it, right? And all of these different things come up, and really, you know, this woman is trying to help, but you know, none of those things I just described are in line with the ethics of this profession. And you know, every profession has its own code of ethics. Every field has behaviors that are considered ethical and moral and good and, you know, best practice. And it's no different with interpreters. So this is a very basic code of ethics. There are more. A really good resource is to go to the American Translation Association's website to get sort of the code of ethics for written translators, or you can go to the National Association of Judicial Interpreters and Translators, and they have a great comprehensive list of interpreter ethics that I think is really valuable. But just for brevity, I've broken them down today into sort of the ones that I think are the most important to teach volunteers from the beginning. And so those are accuracy and completeness, confidentiality, impartiality, boundaries, and I put professionalism in there just because, you know, we're not there as interpreters to be best friends with the people that we're interpreting for. We're there to provide them with equitable access to services, right? And so being professional means sticking to the code of ethics, you know, acting within the best practices of the field to the best of your knowledge and ability. So, you know, when we talk about accuracy and completeness, it kind of goes back to what we talked about last week with translation, where it's not about word for word, it's about making sure that you interpret everything meaning for meaning accurately and completely. So that means don't paraphrase, right? There's an interpreter video online I saw once where a parent is suspected of abuse of their child, and they have an interpreter there who's paraphrasing. And at one point, the social worker asks the parent, you know, well, where did this kid get his black eye? And, you know, the English learner says on the school bus, but then the interpreter conveys it happened on the bus, right? Which is different from school bus. And so then they showed the correct scenario where the interpreter interpreted correctly, accurately, and completely and said it happened on the school bus. And so the social worker is able to say, oh, if it happened on the school bus, then we can get the security camera footage, right? And so it totally changed the dynamic, and it changed the meaning and the outcome just by having omitted school from school bus, right? So you want to make sure that people know that it's not the job of the interpreter to decide what information is important and what information is not important. It's just our job to interpret everything. We also need to convey the spirit of the message, right? Emotion, tone, gestures. Now that doesn't mean that you have to gesticulate crazy and jump up and down, but if somebody is describing depression and saying that they feel sad, you don't want to, as an interpreter, be like, I feel sad, right? You want to try to stay within the tone, the register, the gestures that the subject is saying. So when we say accurately, completely, that also means not omitting like things that might be difficult or uncomfortable, including offensive remarks, gestures, body language, profane language. I've only come across that once in my career, but it was super uncomfortable, and a lot of people aren't comfortable interpreting profanity and things like that. So that's a conversation you want to have with your volunteers also. Now, I personally think that if somebody's not comfortable interpreting profanity word for word, that's okay. But they need to make sure that they're conveying, you know, the subject is using profane language that I'm not comfortable interpreting, right? As opposed to just omitting it totally. But it's also important when we talk about accuracy and completeness not to add anything. And this is really tricky for volunteers because most of us do this work, and most volunteers want, you know, they do what they're doing because they want to help people, right? And so, you know, if they have opinions or insights or comments that they think are helpful, that still distorts the speaker's message, even though it's well-intentioned and even though they may be trying to share resources. What things like that end up doing is actually undermining the relationship between, you know, the social worker and the subject, or the doctor and the subject, right? Because then the interpreter is stepping in and, you know, trying to take over that role. And when that happens, the interpreter becomes the trusted relationship instead of the social worker becoming the trusted relationship, right? And that actually ends up limiting their ability to do their job, and it doesn't really do any good for the English learner either. And that's a big one. I think people are more likely to add opinions and insights and helpful information as opposed to omitting, and it creates, you know, an even bigger problem almost. So when we talk about never adding, omitting, or substituting parts of the message, even if it seems redundant, even if it seems irrelevant, even if it seems rude, you know, again, that's not the interpreter's call to make, right? And that's one thing that professional interpreters do very well. Because when an interpreter does add or omit or substitute information, it takes away from the message. It can eliminate helpful information, right? Like sort of like in the example of the school bus. And it can change the intent of the message entirely in some cases, even without knowing it. Like for example, if there's, let's say, a family member interpreting from or for like a parent or, you know, grandmother, and the doctor is asking the grandmother, how have you been feeling since your last visit? Do you still feel sad? Do you still feel helpless? And then, you know, the ad hoc interpreter might just interpret, doctor wants to know how you feel, right? And so it's not the same conversation when that happens. And people really get left out of being able to participate in their own care. So another thing with accuracy and completeness that is really tricky, even for the most professional interpreters who have been doing this forever, are side conversations, right? In the example of the book that I'm reading, you know, one of the first things that goes wrong is that the midwife asks the patient to go into the room with this other patient to interpret, but a doctor doesn't go in. Right? And so the little girl and the other patient start talking to each other, and they develop this rapport. And this happens all the time when people are interpreting, right? It's nearly impossible for side conversations not to happen. And professional interpreters are very skilled at redirecting side conversations or at making sure they're interpreting the subject's attempts at side conversations, but volunteers in particular probably will fall into the trap of, talking to the people that they're there to help, right? Because that's our instinct. We are hardwired for connection. We want to talk to each other. A lot of the times when you're working with English learners, they're very happy to be around somebody who speaks their language, and they'll ask you, where are you from? How are you doing? I had in my own professional interpreting career, I was like 8 months pregnant in the home of a woman from the Dominican Republic interpreting for a social worker. And the mom, while the social worker was sitting there, just got up and left the room and cooked me this like giant plate of food and put it down in front of me with like a glass of Coke. And, what do you do in that situation, right? So these are the kinds of challenges that it's really important to be careful with, because they're minefields. And side conversations, they really reinforce that problem where the interpreter becomes the trusted one, as opposed to the social worker, as opposed to the doctor. And it can really impede their abilities to do their job. It can really impede the English learners' whole experience, really. So side conversations should be rare, and they should never exclude the other party. And so my suggestion, there are lots of different ways to sort of deflect side conversations, but you don't want to be rude, right? Especially in my job, I worked with children and families, and a lot of the times I was in the home of very isolated mothers who, didn't get out much and didn't have a lot of friends or family here. And so they really were just so desperate to talk and connect, right? And how do you shut that down without hurting people's feelings? And that's one of the really big challenges of being an interpreter. And I think even bigger challenge for somebody who is a volunteer. So stressing that basically when somebody initiates a side conversation with you as an interpreter, you just want to make sure that rather than answering the question directly, you're interpreting, the question, or you're saying to the social worker, oh, the subject is asking me where I'm from, and I was just telling her I'm originally from Pittsburgh, right? So making sure that everybody's in the loop. And when you're doing that correctly, eventually people will stop asking you questions directly, because if you continuously interpret them rather than addressing them or answering them directly, people will get the idea, right? And this is definitely one of the biggest issues with non-professional interpreters. That kind of taps into another big problem that untrained interpreters tend to have, which is that if they know an answer to a question that is asked by a doctor, they may be inclined to just answer the question as opposed to interpreting the question. That's something that happens a lot, and you want to make sure that you are talking to your volunteers about not doing that, right? Because when you interpret everything and you do it accurately and you refrain from engaging outside of that, what we talked about last week was the interpreter box that you put around yourself. That ensures that all of the boundaries of your role are maintained, right? And the boundaries are by far the most challenging thing about being an interpreter. So with that being said, with boundaries comes the question of confidentiality, right? Confidentiality is huge in the world of interpretation. Last year, back in the before times, there was a big kind of conversation within the interpretation community about there had been a meeting between the president and Vladimir Putin, and a lot of people were calling for the interpreter to be subpoenaed and for the notes to be subpoenaed. I don't know if anybody else remembers that, but it was a huge debate within the interpreter community. Because really, we're bound ethically, to be confidential, because if we cannot maintain that confidentiality, then all trust is lost, right? So confidentiality really talks about keeping information totally confidential at all times, right? So treating all information that you learn during the performance of your duties as a potential conflict includes just not ever talking about your subjects at any time, even if you're in a public place, right? Kind of like, I don't know if anyone has ever had a therapist and you bump into your therapist in the grocery store, and they usually won't acknowledge you unless you acknowledge them. it's kind of the same thing, right? If you're in the grocery store and you see, you know, one of the moms that you work with, and they start talking about, you know, the work that you're doing with them, it's really important to just not talk about people. Don't use people's names. Don't refer to the services that are being provided to people, and just kind of treat everything, even that stuff that seems insignificant, right? Treat it as if it were a national security secret. Because when you just treat all information as a national security secret, as super confidential, then you'll kind of get into the practice of always just kind of making sure that you're not talking about any parties who are not directly involved with an interpretation assignment about the interpretation assignment at any time and for any reason. So when I say keeping information confidential, I cannot stress enough that nobody means nobody and never means never, right? So even if my colleague and I, maybe we were interpreting a case together that was a really complicated case, and we're hanging out at happy hour, talking about that case in happy hour would not be appropriate, right? Because maybe the bartender will overhear, or maybe somebody who's sitting 3 seats down knows that person. You just never know. So just treat it as super confidential all the time. My husband has a job where a lot of what he does is top secret, and I have no idea what he does for a living, because we just have a rule in our house. I don't ask him about his work because, you know, he feels weird saying, I can't tell you. So we just don't talk about it ever, right? So that is very important. And some of the best practices for maintaining confidentiality would be to tell your volunteer interpreters to always go through proper channels to get information about a case, about a session, right? And in a lot of cases, that proper channel is going to be you, right? They're not to ask, you know, let's say they're working with a mom. They're not to ask mom for her phone number so that she can call and follow up. They're to ask you to do the follow-up. You're really not supposed to have your volunteers or your interpreters creating files on their computers with information about subjects of encounters. And, you know, you want to tell people that if they have questions about confidentiality or about, you know, what constitutes a breach, you know, they should just speak to, you know, you should tell them to speak to their supervisors, speak to you before they make any decisions on their own. Emails, if you're ever discussing personally identifiable information, especially in the context of healthcare, they also have to be encrypted. And anytime there is a breach in confidentiality, you want to make sure that they know to tell you about it, because that ties into your liability, right, and your exposure as an organization. So another note about confidentiality is HIPAA, right? The Health Insurance or the Health Information Privacy and Portability Act, which deals with what we call PHI, which is protected health information. And PHI under US law is any information about health status, the provision of healthcare, or payment for healthcare that is created or collected by what's called a covered entity. In this case, you would be the covered entity and can be linked to a specific individual. So things like people's phone numbers, street addresses, you know, anything at all that can link a specific person to a service is something you want to be really careful with. Some examples of that are, you know, patient and client names, addresses, really anything more specific than the state. That includes city, county, neighborhood, et cetera. If you say John Smith in Allegheny County, that's a HIPAA breach. Dates, including birth dates, intake, discharge, et cetera, telephone numbers, email addresses, health plan numbers. And, you know, this all relates specifically to healthcare, but, you know, it's just like you want to treat all information like a national security secret. If you apply these standards to all of your work, then you'll be safe, right? And, you know, I would add that, you know, I've never seen a HIPAA breach in my 20-year career, but the fact that it can happen is scary enough, because HIPAA is something that is taken very seriously, and especially with regard to COVID-19, when there's a lot of health and safety information. I would be particularly careful with this if you're sending volunteer interpreters into the field. So the next big one is impartiality. Impartiality is this idea that an interpreter always has to like keep their own biases or personal ideas out of the picture when they're dealing with any kinds of groups or situations in which they would not normally engage, or even in regular situations that they're used to engaging in, regardless of personal beliefs, politics, religion, or bias. And so that means, you know, they need to be sure that they're able and capable to treat all people and groups equally, right? Maintaining neutrality regardless of your personal beliefs or feelings. That one can be tough, right? Because, you know, maybe you're working within a community where family planning is very taboo, or you know, you're interpreting for a mom who wants to explore birth control options or tubal ligation or something like this, and you are personally very against these things or very for these things. It might be hard for you to interpret without injecting little bits of your personal belief or feelings, right? So that's really important. You want to avoid discrimination and stereotyping, even if it's well-meaning stereotyping, like we talked about in the first week, this idea of, you know, English learners being capable adults and not needy, vulnerable people who need us to save them, right? So that's even a stereotype that you have to try to leave out of things in order to accurately, completely, and impartially interpret. And then if they're not able to do that, you know, let them know that they must withdraw from the assignment, right? So if I know that you are super duper duper, like let's say pro-life, and I'm saying that because it's a hot button issue, not to imply either way what people should or shouldn't do or believe. But if I know that you are super pro-life and there's a medical appointment in which somebody wants to talk about, you know, having an abortion, then I would not send you on that assignment. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with interpreters, that you can sometimes match specific interpreters with specific assignments that will suit them in a way that they can be more impartial. So with that being said, impartiality means not exerting influence, not giving advice, and not inserting opinions. And that is a lot harder than it sounds, right? I've had interpreters ask me, well, I know this person is lying, so I need to tell somebody. And that's not our role, right? Giving advice, right? Like when people are trying to apply for SNAP benefits, you know, let's say I have a lot of experience with SNAP benefits and I have an idea that they can get in touch with a specific caseworker and do a specific thing to make their benefits process more quickly. It's not my role to give that advice, right? It is the social worker's role or whoever's working with the family's role. And that's really tough for people because, again, we're in this field because we want to help people, right? So make sure that you're explaining impartiality to people and not stepping out of that interpreter box that we talked about last week, right? Even if you think you're being helpful or acting as an advocate, advocacy and language interpretation are different things. And that's something that's really hard to impress upon people because we want to advocate for the people we're interpreting for, right? We want to advocate always. We want to do the right thing. And I just think it's so important to talk to your volunteers that the best thing you can do to advocate for English learners is to give them their own voice, right? So that they can have equitable access. And then you can put on your advocacy hat when you're volunteering for a direct advocacy service provider, right? But when you're there to interpret, you only should be interpreting, and that's the best thing you can do to help. This also means not offering help, resources, or money to subjects, right? I kind of personally will look the other way if my interpreters want to help. And what I say is, you know, do that on your own time, right? Because I've been there, and it's important to be able to help people, but it does undermine not only an English learner's ability to access and navigate the services that would provide them with that help, but it diminishes the relationship between the service provider and the English learner if you become that trusted link as an interpreter, as opposed to letting the service providers do their jobs. So, some examples of violating boundaries, that kind of ties in nicely with impartiality. Don't disclose your own personal information, right? And when I say don't you, I mean tell your interpreters not to disclose personal information. People should not be giving their personal cell phone numbers to your clients, to the English learners that they're interacting with. They should not solicit business from participants of an encounter. So let's say you have a volunteer interpreter who really enjoys it and is thinking about becoming a freelancer. You want to make sure that that interpreter is not giving out their business card to the social worker during the assignment, right? Because that's inappropriate. You want to discourage your volunteer interpreters from helping participants with phone calls, paperwork, or life management. And this is really hard, right? This is where I go back to this. Interpretation is not advocacy. They're two different things. You can be an advocate, at 6 p.m. after you're done interpreting for the day, right? You can work. So there's this great organization called Casa San Jose in Pittsburgh that works directly with the Latinx community, and they do tremendous, wonderful work, and they're direct advocates. They're out there, helping people with housing. They're out there, creating relief funds for COVID-19. They're advocating, they're working directly. So I, as a volunteer, can volunteer for, let's say, the county health department as an interpreter for a couple hours on a Tuesday, right? And I stay in my interpreter box and I take my role very seriously, but then I can go volunteer with Casa San Jose and volunteer and do direct advocacy through that work, right? But mixing the two is actually considered very unethical in the field of interpretation. And the reason for this is because when you think about, I call it lots of tiny cuts adding up to an injury, right? When you start breaking out of that interpreter box, when you're not speaking in the first person and you're not being impartial and you're offering assistance and you're sharing your personal information, then you're not an interpreter anymore, right? People might not trust that you don't have a bias, right? You're not helping people use their voice to participate in their own services and care and work. You're doing it for them. And when you do that, you're making decisions for people and you are making assumptions for people. And that's just not the role. So I think there's so much overlap with advocacy interpretation that it's really important to make sure that your interpreters understand that, you don't want to be mean to people, but you need to just interpret if you're there in that role. Giving people gifts, objects of value, it's another slippery slope, as well as giving advice, sharing opinions, or just getting involved in any way. When I was younger, before I had a lot of professional training, I had car seats in my car, like way before I ever had my own children. I was giving people rides. I was giving people money. I was staying after every session to help people make phone calls. And I don't regret it at all, but I do understand why that's less than ideal, because I was not able to be an effective interpreter, which was not in the best interest of the families. I ended up getting some calls from 2 a.m. from, people asking me to come pick them up at the bar and drive them home. There was a CYF case that I had to get involved in. And it really just, in retrospect, would have been so much better if I would have let the service providers do their jobs and found other ways to be helpful to the community. Again, this idea of making suggestions and inserting ideas, really make sure you stress that that's not okay for anybody who's volunteering. So I really like this graphic here called the zone of helpfulness, right? Because I think with interpreters, again, we want to help people connect. We want to help people. We want to be there for people. And there's a way to be over-involved. And over-involvement is that giving people rides, lending people money, staying after, helping make phone calls. And then there's under-involved, which, you just don't care at all and you're there to get paid and interpret bare minimum and that's it, right? There's sort of a zone of helpfulness in the middle where you're there to support both the service provider and the subject. And, you know, you're not getting overly involved. You're not being apathetic and underly involved. You're just being present and you're doing your job well, right? You know, being a language translator and a language interpreter is not about the language. There are millions of people on the planet who are bilingual, right? It's about doing all of these little things correctly, right? That's what makes you a good interpreter. That's why people go to school and practice these skills for years, right? That's how you end up being, you know, an interpreter for the UN or a conference interpreter or a simultaneous interpreter. It's years of practicing these skills. So it's also important to make sure your volunteers don't get super intimidated by all of this and, you know, let people know that it's okay to make mistakes, right? This is a skill like anything else that you need to practice and you will get better at. But, you know, doing all of these little things correctly, you know, that's being a great interpreter. That's where the art and the skill of being an interpreter come in versus just being bilingual, right? It's balancing, you know, am I being over helpful or under helpful? Where do I put my body to maximize interaction between the subject and the speaker, you know, speaking in the first person, being as invisible as possible, being accurate and complete, maintaining confidentiality, right? Putting all of these things together is what makes you an interpreter. And I think that pitching it that way to volunteers helps people understand in a very kind of comprehensive way why doing all of these little things together really improves the outcomes of any situation. Okay, so when we talk about just professionalism in general, you know, that to me says code of conduct. How do you behave when you're out in the field? And you want to make sure that your volunteers make sure that they are adhering to the standards of confidentiality, that they have at least the, you know, some of the professional skills and the knowledge required for the specific situation, right? So, you know, if you have somebody who works as a legal clerk during the day and wants to help interpret in the courts, right? That's an example of like somewhere where the skills match. You want to make sure that somebody who's interpreting in a hospital has at least some background knowledge in how hospital you know, operations work, et cetera, et cetera. You want to make sure that conduct is appropriate. You know, it's okay to go to a home visit with a social worker and a small family wearing leggings and a t-shirt because chances are you're going to be sitting on the floor with a bunch of kids jumping in your lap while you're interpreting. But if you're going to go and interpret in a court, you want to make sure that, you know, you dress business casual, right? And so just making sure that people understand how to work and step up to the occasion. Making sure that interpreters demonstrate respect for all participants, maintaining those ethical practices, and engaging in any kind of professional development and training that they can. There are tons of great trainings out there, even on YouTube, that you can pull together for your volunteers and, you know, have them do a basic 10 hours of training before they go out in the field, maybe. You know, in an emergency situation, it'll probably be more of a crash course because you just need to get people out there and sharing information with people. But there are lots of resources, including myself. I'm happy to help you put together a training plan for your volunteers. That's something that I can create a template for, and you can easily plug your own details into. And there are lots of ways just to kind of make sure you're imparting this information on people before you send them out there in the field. So with that being said, I do want to make sure that we have time for more Q&A today with everybody who's on the call being able to participate. We haven't really had the chance to do that because there's been so much information that really we've had like 5 minutes of Q&A and then almost an hour of me talking. So I'd like today for us to have more of a discussion about it. Have you seen these things before in your work, right? Do you have examples that you can share with the group of, you know, times when you have seen interpreters break some of these rules and how maybe that has affected the quality of your care or your services. Does what you've learned today, give you any ideas about how you can do better with your volunteers? I mean, really any, information or experiences or questions that you have to contribute to this discussion, I think would be really valuable to the group. So please just shout them out.
So hi, it's Karen. I think this is the one that probably most of us, at least I know we hear of most frequently. And I'm wondering if you have any tips on how to try and prevent it, which is children translating for their parents.
Yes, this is a huge
whether it's at school, at a parent-teacher conference, or a medical situation. Like, I mean, we hear about that often.
Yeah, that happens all the time. And I think there are two main problems with that situation. One would be the service providers not knowing that that's not okay, right? The service providers thinking it's fine and just kind of blindly allowing it without really questioning it. And on the other side, you have the English learners who might be most comfortable having their children interpret for them, right? And so you kind of have a double whammy there of reasons why this is a really persistent problem. And I think that you have to tackle it from approaching both sides. So it's important to train service providers also, right? I think education about language accessibility and language justice is one of the biggest barriers to having more accessible services to English learners. So you have to find a way to tell, the nurse on Unit 4 or the decision maker within the county that, having children interpret for their parents is something that they're not intellectually able to do, right? They haven't had any of the training we just discussed. Even if they are older and maybe intellectually able, if they haven't been through the training, then, like the video we saw last week, that's a problem. Not being impartial. These are all problems that really do not account for, or that do not allow for meaningful access. And meaningful access is the legal standard, right? You have to provide meaningful access to your services. So talking about that, but in some cases, even when the service provider knows that they're supposed to have a real interpreter and not let children interpret, the families might push back, or the patient might push back. The English learner might say, no, I don't want an interpreter. My daughter's going to interpret for me. And so I always say that one, you should have a waiver, right? That's translated into different languages. We're going to put that in the language access toolkit that we're making. And hopefully you guys will all have access to that. And if not, you can create your own and have it translated into whatever languages. And when you create a waiver, what you're doing is you're telling people that legal right to an interpreter, and that it's better for them to have an interpreter, and that if they still don't want one, they have to sign this form, and in so doing, they're signing away their legal right. And usually when people are shown that respect and they realize that this is a service that's, provided to them, they will say, well, okay, sure, I'll take an interpreter. The other thing you can do is you can talk to the clients or talk to the English learners about how if you have an interpreter, you won't put that stress on your family. A lot of the times children are exposed to information about their families that they shouldn't be exposed to, financial information, health information. I actually had an intern who was, she came here with her family from Syria about 3 years ago and integrated into high school and spoke English very well. She picked it up really quickly, and she has to interpret for her parents all the time. And one day during the internship, she actually broke down crying and was like, I'm failing out of school. I'm not able to do this internship well, because I always have to go to the doctor with my mom, and I always have to do this with my dad. So, finding a way to say that maybe while the child or minor, we'll say, is in the room. The minor child might also speak up and say, no, mom, you should get the interpreter. It's your legal right. So there are lots of sort of gentle ways you can bring it up. But I think having that waiver in place, one, protects you, but also is a way to formally tell people that this is your legal right. in a way that's in their language. And I think that when people feel respected in that way, and they have access to the waiver and, you know, can either have it read to them or they can read it themselves, it will help them understand. And you can put some wording in that waiver also that says, you know, the advantages of using an interpreter are impartiality, confidentiality, et cetera, et cetera. And that may help the situation, but it is a persistent problem and there's no easy answer. So those are just kind of where I would start. And then, you know, depending on your specific situation, there might be better practices.
Thanks.
Sure. Has anybody seen situations where children have interpreted for their families or volunteers have interpreted where things have gone wrong, or any of the examples that I shared today have happened? Okay, does anybody have any questions about?
I was going to share one actually. Mary.
Oh yeah.
Hi everyone.
Thank you.
It's Melissa. So when I worked for the city of Dayton as the Welcome Dayton coordinator, I helped to host a community forum with our Hisko-Turkish community with actually the Housing and Code Enforcement Department. And we had a professional interpreter, and the community leader just did not like her, or I don't know entirely exactly the dynamics, because he essentially took over interpreting for her, and she continued to try to interpret for us, but he was basically interpreting for the community, and then she was interpreting for us, but it became incredibly confusing to have, you know, multiple interpreters going on. There was profanity being used, you know, code enforcement, like it's really, people really riled up when you try to tell them what they can and cannot do with their homes. And so, you know, the piece of, I mean, she did not feel comfortable using the profanity, but she did tell us that it was happening. So I don't know. It was definitely a very memorable experience as far as like how this can kind of go off the rails. But I also had a question, so.
Oh yeah. Well, just one thing to speak to that quickly is that a lot of the times people will use that community interpreter or a family member because they are more likely to tell them what they want to hear, right? As opposed to what's actually being said. You know, and that's something where who are we to tell people what to do with themselves, right? But, you know, there's a way you can kind of shut that down by saying, oh, you know, we're required by law to use our interpreter. It's not you. Thank you so much for trying to help. I'm so sorry, but we can get in trouble if we don't use our interpreter, right? And that way people don't feel like you're passing them over or don't feel slighted or insulted because you're telling them that it's the law and that you're sorry that you might get in trouble. So that's one way to kind of navigate that situation. But with interpreters, nothing is ever smooth or linear or easy. So, you know, it might work, it might not. But what was your question?
Oh, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the advocacy piece, because I think that's something else that I've had challenges with about really understanding, you know, just that balance, you know, of wanting to ensure that, you know, we're client-centered, but also to make sure that people have the information, and if they don't know something, that other opportunities might be available to them if just had a little bit more information. And so I'm just curious, you know, if you can talk about that some more.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one example that I use a lot about the balance is there's this really awesome organization in Pittsburgh that works really intensely with the refugee population, and in particular is really involved in moms. So when a member of the refugee community has a baby, you know, sometimes they're even there in the hospital when the baby's born. And in particular, there's a woman who goes pretty much to every birth, and she's lovely and she's wonderful and she's well-meaning, but she really pushes breastfeeding, right? Breast is best. no matter what. And a lot of the moms have reported feeling shame because maybe they can't breastfeed, or, you know, a lot of conflicting feelings. And the advocate is just trying to like do what she feels is best for the family, right? But what one person thinks is best for the family might not be what's best for that particular family. And it just gets messy, which is why it's really important to kind of like draw that line between advocate and interpreter. With that being said, you know, in situations where what I imagine and what I've seen in my career is I'm interpreting for, I use the example of a social worker a lot because it's just a good kind of like nebulous example. A social worker is not giving the information I know would be helpful to the family, right? So the social worker might be saying, oh, call this number and, you know, maybe they'll give you an interpreter, where I know that there's a program that provides direct access, right? And so what I would say would be in that situation, the best thing to do is to talk to the social worker after the session about making sure they get that information to the family. Or, you know, you can sort of, if there's something like glaringly omitted, I would say it's okay to sort of interrupt the session and say to the social worker, hey, I just want to bring up, there's this new program that you might not know about. You might want to tell mom about that. But then you have to also include mom and say, oh, I'm sorry I interrupted. I was just asking her if she had certain information that she was going to give you, right? So the biggest thing is to make sure that nobody's excluded from the conversation. But I think the bigger problem is making sure that as communities, we are getting people good help. And that way the interpreter, rather than doing the advocacy, can be complementary to that advocacy and that work. And so that's sort of like a separate problem, I think. And, you know, as much as I would like to see interpreters be advocates, it's not the role, because then it kind of sets you up on this slippery slope that if you start providing information, then they're going to start asking you questions and it turns into that feedback loop. So, you know, I think that the role of the interpreter is to stay in the interpreter box, not provide the advocacy, but absolutely bring it up afterward, right? That's a good example of how you can be an advocate. After you're done interpreting, after you've left the home or left the situation, you can pull the social worker aside and say, hey, you know, I'm pretty connected to this community, and here are these other resources that it might be helpful if you shared with the family also. I'm happy to give you more information. Maybe next time we can go back and talk about that, or maybe you can mail translated versions of these flyers to the family, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So Mary Jane, we've kind of had, I think, some issues that relate to this in our community, partly because we've had service providers who are really, you know, obviously bilingual and fluent themselves in languages. And so they take it upon themselves to be the interpreter and the advocate at the same time for the clients. And there's been moments where, I mean, I'm sure that there's times that it's completely fine, but there's been moments where that's been very complicated. Also so at one point there was some, I think a couple of things, but one thing that happened was that we had some service providers who were in conflict with each other, and one of them was being contracted by our JFS department, which is our welfare or social services department, and then they would have clients from the other organization, and then it became this really complicated where they were like, I don't know, they were pulling in our workers to say like, they're not interpreting this correctly because they're from that organization we don't like. And so our organization had to like create a policy where we didn't use either organization for translation and interpretation because of how messy it was getting. They were both blurring the lines between interpreter and social worker or service worker. our service provider worker, and also with confidentiality and professionalism.
Yeah, that's kind of why when I talk about that slippery slope, you know, sometimes it might be the best option to have. So the term in the field for having a bilingual person provide services directly without an interpreter is just called direct in-language services. And so I think ideally there's real value in that. But if you're hiring somebody and they're bilingual, you want to make sure that their pay reflects, you know, asking them to do interpretation work and that they've agreed to it per their contract, and that you also provide that training. But really, you know, having, let's say, we'll go back to the social worker example, having, you know, a Swahili speaking social worker is probably better than having an English speaking social worker with a Swahili interpreter, because they're not interpreting or advocating, they're just providing the services directly in Swahili. But when things become complicated like that and a third party is needed, you know, definitely it can be messy. And this is kind of why exactly interpreters stay in their box, even though our instinct is always to jump in and offer our support and offer our opinion and make sure people are getting all this information. I think that the issue isn't so much that interpreters have to take on the onus of navigating that, but rather that service providers need to make sure that they are putting, you know, qualified interpreters into the field and also providing a high quality service at the same time, right? So it's, we all have to kind of work together to make sure that when I say high quality service, I mean, you know, two competing services can have their own interaction with the family without having it get so messy, right? We had a CYF and county early intervention and county court situation that was really similar, and we were just the provider for the interpreters, but like the caseworker, you know, didn't agree with what CYF was doing, and the court had all these other questions, and it did indeed get very messy using the same interpreter for all three of those. So we ended up using separate interpreters for all three, just to keep them in their own island.
Well, and it seems to me that some of the service providers, at least in our community, that are in language, I don't know that they necessarily have interpreter training, yet they're offering their services as interpreters and translators. And I certainly don't want to restrict them from having a income stream, but it kind of worries me sometimes with our departments where I'm trying to encourage them to use best practices and, you know, so.
That's really hard. And that's one of the biggest problems in the industry. Candidly, a lot of service providers don't really train their staff. They don't really train their interpreters. And it's a big problem. And we've had a lot of luck with doing like big free community training parties, right? We'll get pizza and we'll let people bring their kids, and we'll just have a training weekend where people will come in. But there are also a lot of online resources that I can share. There's a great professional interpreter trainer in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who trains a lot of our interpreters that I would highly recommend. And there are people out there who will do it. It's just, how do you have that conversation with your service provider? You know, that's tough.
Yeah. Well, I would be open to any materials because, yeah.
Well, it's 4 o'clock, so I want to make sure that I am respectful of everybody's time. If anybody wants to squeeze in one more question, I can do that. But otherwise, you know, please feel free to sign up for one of the one-on-one sessions with me this Thursday, every Thursday through the end of June. I will send out any kind of resources I can think of with regard to training interpreters to you all. And I really appreciate you guys being language access champions. I think it's important, and I'm really thrilled to be a part of this. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good week.
See everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jane.
Thank you, guys.